Good morning or afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar Wednesday. For today's presentation, we brought in Robert and Nancy Lavery from Lavery and Associates, who are experts when it comes to Sage 300, and they'll be showing you add-ons that can improve efficiency and security for your business. Please note that today's session is in listen-only mode and should last around 45 to 60 minutes long. If you have any questions, then please write them in the chat option, and we will answer them near the end of the presentation. We have a lot of software tools to cover, so let's go ahead and get started and begin. So I'll now pass it on to Nancy.
Great. Thanks very much, Stephen. And hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today. My name's Nancy Lavery, and as Stephen mentioned, Rob will also be joining us. And we put together this session around improving efficiency and security, safeguarding your business, because the pandemic forced us to change the way we're doing business. A lot of transaction processes have gone virtual, and we had to adapt to fewer people being in an office and more of a need for paperless flows of information that can be accessed easily, but you still want to maintain your security and privacy. So we wanted to talk today about a few software tools that will help with compliance and illustrate how you can still work with remote workers, but also safeguard your data. So some of the products we want to talk about today, one of them is called SOX Second Sight, and that forces a segregation of duties within Sage 300. There's different ways to safeguard your business and force a segregation of duties. In some cases, you can just use the Sage 300 security to grant users access to certain features they need within Sage 300. So therefore, you can limit what they can do within Sage 300, but that may not always be sufficient. If you have a department of workers that are all doing the same job, you may want to be able to grant them the access in Sage 300, but you still want to safeguard against, fraud, for example. So with SOX Second Sight, you can grant users the access to all the features they need in Sage 300 and still force a segregation of duties. Basically, at least two sets of eyes need to be participating within the creation and posting of batches. So we'll have a quick look at that solution. And it's a very easy solution for you to install within your Sage 300 environment. The next product we're going to have a look at is the SOX Check Approval product. And this is going to force an approval process around payments. And when we're looking at that product, we're also going to be viewing the document management link product, as well as the notes product. So with those products, we're giving you the ability to view information from within Sage 300. So by forcing approvals around key processes, there's definitely a lot of software solutions out there that can help you with this. Today, we're going to focus around just the AP payments with SOX Check Approval. So you can force the approval process around the creation of payments, and we'll show you that document management link integration with that. So you'll be able to view documents throughout that approval process. And one of the key benefits for this software is the approvals for those payments. The person doing those approvals or people doing those approvals do not have to log into Sage 300 in order to do that. We have an external approval console that users can just access from their start menu. Or if you wanted to run it on something like an iPad, you could do that with the proper infrastructure. And then we're going to round it out with Rob, who's going to talk to you about some privacy legislation that you should be aware of, as well as showing you the EFT product, which gives you the ability to automate electronic payments and receipts within Sage 300. So without further ado, I'm going to just pop over into the software and we'll have a look at the software. You'll notice that all of the products we're talking about today are fully embedded in your Sage 300 environment. So we're not duplicating any data. You're able to access all of the data you currently have. And in the case of SOX Second Sight and the TaiRox Check Approval products, you're not changing anything about the way you're doing processing within Sage 300 currently. So these will all install as modules within the menu. You'll see them appear, so you'll just activate them through admin services the same way you would any of your Sage modules. And SOX Second Sight, as I mentioned, is a real easy product to install. So you install and activate it, it will appear in the menu, and there's literally just the one setup screen where you can choose which types of entries you want to force a segregation of duties around. So that could be your accounts payable, your invoice entry, payment entry, and adjustment entry, as well as your accounts receivable. So you can just, by activating the tick box, it signifies which screens you want to force that segregation of duties against, as pardon me, as well as the general ledger. So just as an example, if we go up into accounts receivable, into the batch screen, I created a batch ahead of the presentation, so today's date, just for one entry, and you notice it's an open batch. If I open up this up, you'll see that I created the entry in the batch as the admin user. And you're seeing document management link appearing here beside the screen. We'll talk about that some more when we get to the check approval product. But you see that this entry has been entered by the admin user. And I'm pointing that out because I'm currently logged in as the admin user. If I try to post this batch, it's saying, do you want to set it to ready to post? I'll say yes to that. And I'm going to get a message popping up saying that I cannot set that batch to ready to post because I either created or changed an entry within that batch. So it's just working in the background to ensure that if someone participates in the entry of the batch, they cannot be the person that posts it. So today I could create entries, but I can't post. If I look at another batch where I didn't create any entries, I would be able to post that. So you're granting users all the same access to do everything, but the software is going to be doing a check in the background to make sure at least 2 users participate in the batch. Now, when we talk about the SOX Check Approval product, again, a fairly simple product for you to get installed and working within your environment. I mentioned the approval database. So that's going to be an approval console that users will access from their start menu. And it's just a SQL instance that we're using. So this first line provides access to that SQL instance. And then you would simply come to the database tab and hit the create button, and it creates the necessary tables. You have some options with the TaiRox Check Approval. You can have up to 3 levels of approval. So you can specify 1, 2, or 3 levels of approval. And then within these boxes, you'll see a list of the users you have set up in Sage 300. And you can just activate a tick box for the people that are responsible for doing approvals. So in my case, my level 1 approver is a general manager, and they can approve up to $2,000. If anything exceeds $2,000, then it's going to go to the controller. The controller has a limit up to $5,000, and anything that exceeds $5,000 is going to go to the CEO. Now, I have it specified that only payments under $2,000 go to the general manager. Only payments between $2,000 and $5,000 go to the controller, and only payments above that go to the CEO. So I'm forcing the separation based on amounts. You could have it go to every level if you would like. So you could have everything go to level 1. The general manager still can only approve up to $2,000, but when it goes to level 2, they'll see all of the payments in the batch. So it's completely up to you how you want to do that. The other thing that I've activated is I've specified that when things go into my approval console, Anything under the specified value, in my case, $500, I'm saying send that into the approval console as approved. I don't need my approvers to be reviewing small amounts. So I'm setting my threshold at 500. Someone else may want to set that at 100. Whatever the case may be, smaller payment amounts can be sent into the console as approved already, so that those approvers are only spending time reviewing those payments above the specified amount. You could send everything in as unapproved and force the user to activate the tick box next to each payment, or you could send everything in as approved and the user will review it and uncheck those that they don't want to approve. So you do have the ability to decline a payment within a batch, and then either the user would re-enter that payment when you're ready to make the payment, or in my case, I've specified if anything gets declined within a batch, then I want to create a new batch for those payments. So this is a way for us to ensure that you don't have to hold up an entire payment batch just because there's a few payments within it that you're not ready to process. And lastly, for the setup portion of it, there are email notifications. So you can send notifications throughout the approval process to notify a user when there's something for them to approve. And at the end of the process, when that batch is ready to be posted, you can email the person that initially submitted that for approval to let them know that they can go ahead and process that payment batch. So when we go up into accounts payable, you'll see, again, we're not changing what you're already doing. So I've created this batch for today's purposes. And within this batch, we'll see the document management link window appearing. And so the way document management link works is we're providing a way for you to view documents within Sage 300, but not consume database space. So these documents are stored outside of Sage 300. In my case, I'm just storing these documents in a network folder, but you could also store documents in, Google Docs or Dropbox. Or if you're using Microsoft Server, you could use SharePoint as well. The product is providing a link from where you're storing the document to the screen of Sage 300 and displaying the contents of the folder here in the document management link window. So we're linking to a field on the screen. So in this first instance, we're linking to the vendor number field. And then based on the contents in that field, and in our case, my vendor number 1400, it points to the vendor 1400 folder and displays the contents in that folder. If that value were to change, then this window will dynamically change as soon as this vendor number changes. I can get straight to that folder from the document management link window. So I can see on my C drive, I've got a folder I named Orchid. I have a document folder for the different types of documents I'm storing. And then for my AP documents, I have folders for my different vendors. And we're seeing the contents of that folder in the document management link window. Now, once you get this hierarchy in place, if I were to store a document for a vendor that does not currently have a folder, then the software can create that folder and then file the document. So, it will build out for you automatically once you get that main structure in place. Now, what I've done in the second window is I'm filtering the contents of that vendor number folder. I want to easily be able to see the documents that relate to this particular invoice entry. So when you want to add a document, you'll see I can hover over the document management link window and I can just go out into my environment, click on a document and drag it and drop it over the document management link window. And it's going to refile that document. So in my case, from the suspense folder, it's put a copy of that document into my vendor 1400 folder. The other thing you may notice it did was it changed the name of the document from invoice to under 500, and that's based on the value in the document number field. So that's an optional configuration where I specified if I link a document through this window, I want you to change the name of it based on whatever the value is in the document number field. So the other configurations I have here is around the purchase order number as well as the GL account. And that's just to illustrate, different configurations. But you can configure document management link around any screen in Sage 300. So any module, any screen. And, you're basically only limited to your imagination as to how you want to be storing and viewing your documents. Now, you may notice what this green box is in the window. That is another product, and it's a note product, and it gives you the ability to store free-form notes. But it works the same as Document Management Link does in the sense that you're going to store a note against a field in Sage 300. And the same as Document Management Link, you can store a note around any field in Sage 300. So that's the document management link and notes. You'll see the document management link working as we move through the check approval process as well. So what I've done with this batch is I've created an entry that's under $500. So when we create the payment for this and go through the approval process, we're going to expect that to go into the approval console as approved based on the setting that I have, that anything under $500 just goes through as approved. But I also created some additional payments here. So we've got one that's under 2,000. So it's over 500, but under 2,000. So we'll expect that to go to our general manager for approval. And then I've got two that are over 2,000, but under 5,000. And I've created two for that category because I'll show you, we'll decline one of those and we'll approve one. So we'll expect those two to go to our controller for approval. So I wanted to start at AP invoice entry just to show you that nothing about that process is going to change. So I'm going to go ahead and post this invoice batch. And then we're going to go ahead and create the payments for those four. So let's go into the standard payment entry screen here, and we'll create a new entry. So again, we're not changing anything about the way you're currently entering your payments. We're just going to add the approval process around the same screen that you're familiar with. So we'll just call this March 9, 2022. And we'll create a payment. Now I've done them all for vendor 1400, but of course yours would have multiple vendors. Just for ease sake, I just used one vendor for today. So let's call this entry 1. And we'll pull up that invoice. And you notice the document management link window working here. So let's pull up the one that was under $500. And there's the document that we saw in the AP invoice entry screen, as well as our vendor documents. So I should make the point, those documents are only stored once, but you can view them against multiple screens in Sage 300. So let's go ahead and we'll add that payment for the under $500. That's just a remit to location. We're okay. And then we'll enter our entry number 2. And that one, sorry, I don't know. Okay, are we okay? No, sorry about that. I don't know. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. So the next one is the under 2,000. So we'll add a payment for that. And
Nancy, we had a quick question. Would you need a separate entry for each vendor?
No.
Okay.
You would do the payment entries the same as you're doing now. So you could have multiple vendors in the same payment batch. I just used one vendor, to make it easier on myself, but you can certainly have as many. It's the same as what you're doing currently. Nothing about that should change. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all. Okay, so that's our 4 payments we've added to our payment batch. So here's where the TaiRox check approval kicks in. So everything I've done so far would be everything that you're currently doing. Where the difference lies is when you try to post this batch. So you can't post the batch or print checks until it's been approved. And you may notice there's an additional button on the screen. So that's the only learning curve, is this additional button. If I try to print or post the batch, it's going to say it hasn't been approved. So you can't print the checks, and therefore you can't post the batch. So what the user will do is submit that for approval. And as soon as it's going to send an email notification of that, and it's going to update the status of the batch. And so it's going to sit in an in progress status. So anyone else logging into this screen is going to see that batch number 65 is in progress in terms of getting approval done. You can click on this and it will show you, as it's moving through the approval process, you'll see who it's been approved by. And in this case, we can see the 4 payments that are pending approval right now and who they were entered by. So this is where the user would open their approval console, and it's a very simple approval console. So we're going to do our first approver as the general manager. Now, for any of you that are running multiple Sage 300 companies, you can filter multiple companies into the same approval console. So if the same person is responsible for doing approvals across companies, then you can filter them into the same approval console and you'd see a tree view. So you'd see company 1, the batches, company 2, the batches, and so on. So here's our March 9th, 2022 batch that we've created. And you'll notice that this tick box here under the approved column is because we have that payment that was under $500. So it went into the approval console as approved. And then we have our second payment that was within the approval limit of our general manager. And here I can see the document. So the approvers can view those documents as well when they're doing the approval. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll approve this, save that and approve it. And then what will happen at this point is an email notification would go to the next person in line to do the approval. And they would then log into the approval console. So that's our controller. And here we'll expect to see the other 2 payments in that batch that exceeded the $2,000. So they're higher than the general manager's approval limit, which is why they've come to the controller for approval. So we'll go ahead and approve the one for 3051, and we'll say we're not approving the second one. Now, the software is going to force a comment. So anything that you're not approving, it wants to know why. There's an audit log that someone can go and look at and view those comments. So we're just going to say pay this later and save that. And we'll go ahead and approve it. Now, once all of the approval criteria has been met, there's no additional process. An email notification would go to the person that wants to process this batch to let them know that it's been approved. And you'll see here our batch number 65 for the 3 payments that we approved is now sitting in an approved status. And the one that we did not approve has been created a new batch number 66 for payments that weren't approved in batch 65. So at this point, I can go ahead and I can print those checks and post the batch. There we go. And we can go ahead and post that batch. So that concludes where the TaiRox check approval product comes in. But now Rob's going to talk to you about EFT. So maybe you don't want to print checks and mail paper checks to your vendors. Maybe you want to send a file electronically to the bank to make those payments. So this is where, once this payment batch has been posted, this is where you can go ahead and create an EFT file to send to the bank. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rob to show you the EFT product and talk to you about some privacy legislation that you might want to keep in mind.
That's great. Thank you, Nancy. And this is the privacy dilemma that Nancy was referring to, which is part of what we call PIPEDA, which is short for the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. And essentially, there's 10 fair information principles for organizations that conduct commercial activities, which would be, I imagine, all of you in the audience today. If you're working in a small, medium-sized enterprise, whether that's a for-profit or not-for-profit organization, you would generally fall under these guidelines in which you have to guard against what they call a breach of security safeguards. And the definition is the loss of, unauthorized access to, or unauthorized disclosure of personal information. And they go on in the legislation to describe what that personal information is, which includes bank account details that you would have to have in order to send electronic payments to your vendors. Same thing for your employees if you're doing direct deposit for payroll purposes, but also other information about your customers and your vendors that is stored within Sage 300. Now, it requires organizations like yours to have in place physical, organizational, and technical security safeguards, which are appropriate to the sensitivity of the information to avoid what they define as significant harm, which goes back to the breach of security safeguards definition in point 2. Now, when we talk about physical safeguards, those would be environmental controls around are you matching reporting information from different sources to confirm that what you produced as a payment journal in accounts payable is actually what you produced for your NACHA payment, ACH, and that's what actually got processed by the bank. By an organizational control, you might consider something like segregation of duties, where the person who posts the payment batch is not the same person who creates the EFT file or uploads it to the bank. And a technical security safeguard would be approvals like you saw with the TaiRox SOX Check Approval that are built into Sage 300 that create a workflow approval where you prohibit posting of the AP payment batch until it's been appropriately approved by the right individuals within your organization. So those are the reasons why we combine these products together to show you how you can incorporate payment approvals, which then give you better reliability that what you're paying electronically, because now nobody's actually signing a physical check, but also an audit trail where you can demonstrate that there was a workflow process in place. It got approved by these individuals on these days, and those payments are directly related to the electronic file that you sent to your bank. And then there are some reporting requirements if a breach occurs and what steps you're going to take to mitigate those breaches. But what we want to do is highlight for you how you can meet these requirements as a best practice so that you don't ever fall offside with these regulations. And to do that, it's important to note that EFT is an application that's written in what we call the SDK, or the Software Development Kit for Sage 300. So if you're familiar with the administrative services, you know that there are security groups where you define access rights for the users in your company that will provide a safeguard as to what kind of information they see and what they're able to do with that information. So as an example, we talked about segregating duties within Sage 300. What you might want to do from a vendor perspective is allow one person to set up a vendor within EFT and another person to go in and approve that vendor so that they can start receiving electronic payments, and thereby enable a segregation of duties within the software itself. And the other thing that we do when we're setting up the options for these vendors, we can default the vendor status as entered, active, or inactive. And if you default it to entered, then somebody else has to come in and change that status to active. And that ensures that there's at least one level of review and approval. And the approval, while technically not a workflow, it's system-based, where someone has to come in and change the status to active. And they can only do that if you give them the access right to approve the vendor details within EFT. So that's a simple example of how the segregation of duties provides some control over access to and disclosure of your vendor's sensitive bank information. Because of course, you're going to need their bank account details, the branch, financial institution number, and account number in order for you to be able to process these payments electronically directly to their bank accounts. There are other options such as encrypting that vendor information when we're creating a remittance advice. So one of the other things we do is we generate a advice which demonstrates what has been paid to the vendor. And I'm just going to print off a hard copy to the screen so that you can see what the form looks like and the kind of information that's on it, as well as the encrypted details on that advice. And again, this will provide a level of assurance that only the appropriate people have access to this sensitive banking information of your vendors. So as you can see here, it's got the information about the vendor and then their bank details. And you notice that the account number is highlighted and it's not allowing you to see the sensitive account details. And then it's going to give you information about the document itself and whether it's been properly emailed, because that's the other option that we want to show. In addition to highlighting the details about which invoices were paid and the fact that it is a remittance advice, these are standard crystal forms that you can modify to change the format or the layout and content of these forms. But rather than printing, we would suggest you email. Since you're going to be making payments electronically, then we'd suggest you email to the vendor based on email recipient email addresses. And you would set those up in the vendor file here within EFT. So you can use the EFT vendor email, or you can use the AP vendor delivery method, which is the email addresses that you've set up against the vendor master file within the accounts payable module. And as you may be familiar, there's a processing page where you define the delivery method as email or contacts email. And if it's the contacts email, then we pick up the email address on this page, the contact page. And if it's email, it picks up the email address on the address page. And if you've got more than one recipient, you can simply create 2 or 3, depending on how many characters will fit in the 60 character limit, by using a semicolon to separate the different email addresses you would like to send those emails to. And the email itself is something else that you set up where you can define an email template for payments and use variables to identify the vendor contact details, the payment date, the list of documents paid, and your company name. So instead of just automating payments, we automate the entire process where you not only send the payment electronically, but you send the remittance advice to the vendor via email as an attachment. And those email options are set up so that you generate the emails directly to the email server. So you can send a bulk email with multiple vendor contacts with the remittance advices attached. and you don't need to sit there and email one at a time. Sorry, the other thing I should mention here too is the CC and BCC, so that you can demonstrate that you are effectively emailing to these vendors. And you could BCC an internal email inbox to make sure that the information going out is appropriate. Now, there are some other options here, such as a password formula. So when you use a remittance advice password, you generate the formula for the format of the password, and then you would share that with one of the people at your vendor site. And there again, you're safeguarding the fact that only that individual would be able to open the remittance advice and see the details of the payment that's been made. But as we mentioned off the top, what we're doing is we're simply replacing the generation of the paper-based check from the AP payment batch that's been created within the accounts payable module. And notice that I could use a range of batches. I can also choose individual entries from within a batch. So just because I'm sending payment electronically, I could flag just one of the payments to be sent because the customer has, or the vendor has an urgent need to be paid for some reason, or you want to make another purchase and the vendor's saying, well, you got to pay down your outstanding balance before we're willing to ship you any other goods. And so by being able to individually select the payment and expedite it, you're able to make that payment quickly and efficiently. Also note that if your bank will support transaction date as a payment date, then you'll be able to create one EFT file and send payment different days, or have the bank process payment on different days based on the transaction date rather than the file upload date. So these are all options that you can use in order to safeguard the data again. Now, because it's sensitive data and we want to make sure we can demonstrate that we're not only tracking the setup of the vendors, but the payments being made, we have a log where we keep track of every time a vendor has been set up in the system. And we give you a time and a date stamp for the vendor details, the user within Sage who set up the vendor, and the information that was populated to the EFT vendor master file. And then if you were going to use the segregation of duties concept, you could show that this person entered the vendor and then someone else came in and updated the status from entered to active. And that would also be captured within this audit log table, so that not only have you created the segregation of duties through your administrative services security access rights, but now you've got an audit log to demonstrate that as vendors were being added to the system, there was an approval process that has been logged in the system. So it's there for further review at some date in the future. And in addition to that, we keep track of every time an EFT file has been created. So again, we have a date and a time stamp, the fact that it was a payment batch, the user who created that EFT file, from which bank, where the file is stored, and the dollar value of the transactions that are going up to the bank. Now, this file path is important if you're going to be generating the EFT file as one step and then uploading it to the bank as a second step. And here again is an opportunity to create a segregation of duties where you have one person creating the file and then a separate person who's going to upload the file to the bank. And from this log, you can see how by drilling into the log, it would list the payments that were part of that file. But if we were going to segregate it, then when we set up the bank, we would use an output destination file. But some banks will be able to support an output destination that is not just file, but it would be potentially an SFTP format. So I'm going to try a different file type here. And you see now it supports a secure file transfer protocol with a password. And so if your bank has the ability to take the file that you generate and upload it automatically once you generate it, then they will be able to provide the host name for the server where the website is, where they process these payments. And then you can put your user ID and password into the setup of Sage 300. And that way you don't have to create the file as one step and upload it as a second step to the bank website. You can do that all in one step. So that would either be with the password or with a key file, otherwise known as a token, where the key file is a series of numbers, letters, and characters that are the encrypted information that is stored so that you can update and authenticate who you are, and then the bank will process the file appropriately. Now, speaking of the file type itself is extremely important to being able to successfully send payments up to your bank. Now, we have a number of different formats that are supported across multiple banks in the US and, in fact, around the world. And it's not just making payments by a check. You can use positive pay, where you're sending a file and still producing paper-based checks, but you can also support wire payments. You can do pre-notes. You can also do bulk payments, where you're sending a flat file, which could be like an Interac bulk payment, if you're familiar with the Interac system. There are a number of different formats, both domestic and international, that are supported for US financial institutions. And this is really the most critical aspect of being able to deploy EFT processing successfully, because what you'll need to do is ask your financial institution for what they call the specification, which is a document that lays out the file format, which includes the number of fields, the length of the fields, and the data within each of these fields that's required in order for the bank to process the file successfully. And as long as they have a file type that supports different kinds of payments, which could also include credit card or PayPal, then you'll be able to process these payments. Now, when I say credit card, let me be clear that we're not a merchant account. So you would still need a separate merchant account to authorize the credit card payment. But in terms of processing it and sending it to the bank, you can do that through the EFT ACH system. So that's the important aspect of being able to enable Sage 300 to support electronic payments through the file type that you set up against the EFT bank. And once you've got that, you're able to define the vendors you want to pay, and you'll be able to send those transactions electronically. Now, in terms of creating the AP payment batch itself, there are two options. You could have a combination of check vendors and EFT vendors. And in that case, you would want to skip over the vendors within the payment batch that are not labeled as EFT or ACH vendors. Now, that's best practices, however, we would suggest that you separate the batches if it's at all possible, so that you have a clean audit trail of just EFT ACH vendors in the batch. And then you can create an EFT file just for that series of vendor payments. Because by combining the check and EFT vendors, you're not really saving any steps, because you would still have to process the batch twice, once for EFT purposes and then once for check purposes. And you can do that by setting up your vendor with a payment code called EFT rather than check USD vendor. And if you create separate payment codes, then if you're familiar with the create payment batch function, you're able to use criteria to select which vendors you want to include in that payment batch. And EFT is a way for you to segregate your ACH payment vendors from your check vendors. So using payment code would allow you to create that separate series of payment batches. It might also be based on vendor group or other criteria that you wish to use. That ensures that the payment batch only has vendors earmarked as EFT or ACH. Some of our clients have actually gone to the extent of creating a unique series of check numbers, depending on whether it's a check payment or an EFT payment. And that is facilitated by creating a different check stock code under your bank in bank services, so that you'll have one series of numbers for laser-based checks and another series of numbers for your EFT checks that will support a different kind of check form, which might really just be an advice in the case of EFT because the payment's now electronic, but you would still have the vendor details and the list of documents that have been paid as part of that electronic payment. Now, that's not necessary, of course, but it is a way for you to create a nice, clean audit trail if you want to go to that extent. But the other thing I wanted to highlight as we conclude is that there is a transfer details report. So in addition to the segregation of duties and some of the controls that we've shown, whether it's the vendor payment approval within AP, which is the SOX Check Approval, or whether it's the segregation of duties within EFT and the audit logs that we're keeping track of, and the segregation around setting up of vendors, there is an EFT transfer details report that's produced to verify the payments that have been made for each of the EFT files that have been created. And this is similar to the information you saw in the audit log for the EFT file. There's a date and a timestamp, the payment, the bank, and where the file was stored, who created it, and a list of the vendors that have been paid to which accounts and the fact that it was successfully done. So as an environmental or organizational control, if we use the PPTA language, you could compare this transfer details report with the posting journal from the accounts payable module and a report from your bank to verify that what we set up as a payment within AP was processed as an EFT file within EFT Processing. And that was what was ultimately processed by the bank based on the report that they send back to you. And that's more of an environmental control to help people gain trust in the system. But Nancy showed you how you can limit posting of the payment batch using SOX Check Approval. And within EFT, we can say that we do not allow unposted batches from AP to be selected. And by definition, if that were the case, if you're only using a posted AP payment batch and you don't allow unposted, you're only using posted batches, you know that those are approved because you can't post the batch in the first place unless it's been approved. So it depends on how far you want to go with the system controls as to what you're comfortable with. But then you also have the fallback of the reports as an environmental control to verify that what you wanted to pay is actually what got paid and processed by the bank. So I'm going to stop there, Stephen, and ask if we have any questions at this point.
Yes. So Robert, when you were presenting, someone asked, can you see who made changes, or is it just a change that was made?
Great question. So in the administrative services, under security, or sorry, the audit log here, you would see the name of the user because the log itself has the username within Sage. So right here, that column, they're all admin because I've done all the work in the sample company, but you would actually see the different usernames here for someone who entered and then someone who changed the status from active or from entered to active.
Sweet. So we did have some more questions that came in, but at this time, if you guys do have questions, please feel free to write them in the chat option and we'll read them out loud. Another one that came in for you was, how does EFT processing support payments in different currencies?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you for that. So these transactions, when we're creating against an EFT file, they can only handle one currency at a time, and that's a bank standard. They don't allow us to mix US dollars with Canadian dollars or euros or any other type of currency. So when you're generating the payment batch in accounts payable, you would have to choose the payment currency, and only similar payment currencies can be included in one EFT file.
Perfect, thank you. Another one that came in, it says, what if my AP vendor has more than one bank account that I need to send a payment to? How do I handle this?
Great question. With the vendors, there's a remit to address. So because within accounts payable, you could have different remit to addresses for different offices that you're paying, maybe different remit to contacts. We also support a different remit to for each of the vendors within EFT, because we're really just picking up the standard vendor information from within AP and adding their bank details so you can send payment electronically. And then we also support the remit to address, so you can have multiple bank accounts assigned to the same vendor based on the different remit tos that you have in accounts payable.
Thank you. And then we had another question. Is this functionality associated with software upgrade, or which version is I can't even say the word, attributable to?
Yeah, so the version of Sage 300 that you're running today would have to match with the version of EFT Processing. So if you're running 2020 as an example, you would need to install version 2020 of EFT Processing. And so the system info will show you the versions that you're running, and EFT Processing must match with the rest of your Sage 300 system.
Perfect. Thanks, Robert.
Mhm.
I think looks like that's all the questions we have. So I'll go ahead and wrap up. So thank you all for joining us today. If you do have any additional questions, then please reach out to your assigned account manager, or you can email us at am@acumenfl.com. If you haven't yet, also be sure to follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook for the latest Sage content and also updates about upcoming webinars. And speaking about updates, we'd also love to hear your feedback on webinar topics that you would like to see in the future. So please be on the lookout for my emails as well. And with that, I believe that's all we have for you. So thank you, Robert and Nancy, for the great presentation. And we hope to see you guys all again soon.
Thanks very much.
Thanks very
guys.
much.